her billionaire CEO husband, threw her out for being childless. Months later, she was in labor and saw her billionaire CEO ex, her child's father, with his sick wife in the same ward. Wilma had always imagined the first moment of meeting her child as something quiet, maybe tears sliding down her cheeks, maybe a whisper of gratitude in the soft space of a hospital room. Instead, it came wrapped in chaos. Her body tightened without warning, pain rising like a wave she couldn't escape. A nurse rushed toward her bed, calling for help, wheels already rolling her down the hallway. Wilma clutched the thin blanket, breathing in sharp, broken pieces as the world blurred into white walls and rushing footsteps. "Stay with me, sweetheart," the nurse said gently, but Wilma was barely there. Another contraction seized her, stealing her voice. She turned her head to the side, searching for something solid to hold onto. A clock, a door frame, anything that reminded her she was still real. That was when she saw him, not across the room, not in a memory, standing less than 10 feet away. Tristan Colpin, her former husband, the man who once promised never to leave her. The same man who walked away when her body failed to meet his expectations. He was dressed in a dark tailored coat, one hand gripping the handle of a small overnight bag. But it wasn't his face that froze Wilma's breath. It was the woman beside him, pale, fragile, leaning against his chest as though the floor itself might vanish beneath her. Tristan lifted his eyes. The hallway went silent in Wilma's ears. Their stares collided, hers wide with disbelief, his breaking apart in slow motion. And just like that, the night she was about to become a mother became the night her past walked straight back into her life. For a moment, Tristan didn't move. He looked at Wilma's rounded stomach as though it were something he had dreamed into existence. His lips parted, but nothing came out. The nurse pushing Wilma's bed slowed when she sensed the tension thickening in the corridor. "Wilma?" he finally said, his voice stripped of authority, stripped of the man who commanded boardrooms. She didn't answer right away. Another contraction tightened through her, forcing a sharp cry from her chest. When it passed, she met his stare again, steady now, not because the pain was gone, but because she had carried far heavier things than pain over the past months. "Yes," she said quietly. His gaze drifted back to her stomach. "You're expecting?" Wilma let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years. "I'm in labor," she replied, "and the child I'm bringing into this world is yours." The words struck him harder than any accusation ever could. His fingers tightened around the bag he carried, knuckles paling. The woman beside him lifted her eyes slowly, studying Wilma with no trace of anger, only tired curiosity. "You mean," Tristan whispered, the sentence collapsing halfway. "You threw me out because you thought I couldn't give you a family," Wilma said, her tone gentle, not bitter. "And now you're standing here while I'm about to give birth to the child you stopped believing would ever exist." He swallowed hard. The nurse cleared her throat softly, glancing between them. "We need to get her to the delivery ward," she said. But Tristan still stood rooted to the floor, trapped between the woman he married for hope and the woman he left because he lost it. As the nurse pushed Wilma's bed forward again, she turned her face away from Tristan, but the question inside her refused to stay silent. How many people had given their whole heart to someone who only valued results? How many had stood in the ruins of a relationship, wondering when love had turned into a transaction? Maybe you've been there. Maybe you once believed a promise that felt unbreakable, only to watch it disappear the moment life became inconvenient. Maybe you've sat in a quiet room after being left behind, asking yourself what you did wrong when all you ever did was love honestly. Wilma had asked herself those same questions during countless lonely nights. She had replayed every conversation, every memory, searching for the moment she supposedly failed. Not because she didn't know the truth, but because the heart always tries to make sense of loss. And right now, as she was being wheeled down a corridor toward the moment that would define the rest of her life, the man who once said he would never walk away was standing behind her, frozen by the reality he had chosen not to wait for. If you've ever felt like someone you loved turned their back when things became difficult, stay with this story, because Wilma's journey isn't about heartbreak. It's about what happens when a person finally realizes that their worth was never measured by someone else's expectations. There is a quiet rule that too many people live by, even when they never say it out loud. Build your name, build your future, build something impressive enough that no one questions your choices, and when something or someone no longer fits that image, replace it. Tristan had lived by that rule longer than he would ever admit. In boardrooms, strength was rewarded. In headlines, achievement mattered more than character. Somewhere along the climb, loyalty stopped being a promise and started being a condition. Wilma had felt that shift long before the divorce papers ever touched the table. At dinners with business partners, she was introduced as if she were an accessory, the graceful wife, the quiet presence. But when the subject of children came up, she noticed the way conversations stalled, the way expectations leaned toward her shoulders. In a world obsessed with measurable results, no one asked how much love she carried. They asked what she could produce. Now here she was, about to give birth in a hallway where ambition had once replaced compassion. The man who left her had gained everything the world applauds: wealth, influence, status, and still stood trembling because none of it could undo the choice he had made. This is what happens when success becomes more important than commitment. You don't just lose people, you lose yourself. As Wilma was rolled past Tristan, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the metal door of the ward. Flushed skin, damp hair, eyes burning with more than pain. This wasn't the woman who once begged silently for his attention. This was someone else entirely. Tristan finally stepped forward, his voice cracking as he followed. "Wilma, please, just let me explain." She didn't answer, not because she couldn't hear him, but because she already knew that whatever words he carried would come too late. He had once believed the future was something he could plan, something he could force into existence by cutting away whatever slowed him down. Yet here he was, watching the one person he had abandoned walk into motherhood without him. What Wilma was about to do after her child was born would surprise everyone. Not revenge, not pleading, not a return to the life she had lost. Her decision would redraw the meaning of strength, and by the time the story ends, you may find yourself questioning every idea you ever had about love, forgiveness, and what it truly means to move forward. Before this story carries you any further, pause for a moment. If you believe that love should not disappear the instant life becomes difficult, this channel was created for you. If you've ever watched someone choose comfort over commitment, or walk away when loyalty mattered most, then you already understand why stories like Wilma's need to be told. So take 1 second right now and tap the like button. It helps this story reach people who might be standing in the middle of their own silent heartbreak. Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Should anyone ever be measured by what they can provide rather than who they are? And if you want more stories that speak to the parts of life we don't always talk about, go ahead and subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime. You're not just joining a channel, you're joining a place where real emotions are respected and every story carries meaning. Now let's go back to Wilma, because the night her life collided with her past was only the beginning. The city beneath Tristan Colpin's office never truly slept. From the 62nd floor, traffic lights flickered like restless stars, towers blinking in patterns no one ever noticed unless they were awake at the wrong hour, or the right one, depending on how you define success. His office walls were made of glass, clean and flawless, meant to showcase the empire he had built. Awards lined a floating shelf behind his desk. Magazine covers framed in steel stared back at him from the far wall, each headline celebrating a man who never seemed to lose. Yet here he was, well past midnight, with the weight of the world pressing against his temples. He loosened his tie and leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting across the room as if searching for something that had slipped away. Contracts lay in careful stacks. His phone blinked with unread messages. Somewhere, an assistant had probably gone home hours ago, leaving him with the silence he insisted he preferred. But silence, when you sit in it long enough, starts asking questions. Tristan had learned how to master numbers, how to negotiate people twice his age into backing his vision, how to smile for cameras even when he hadn't slept. He knew how to present confidence with surgical precision. What he didn't know how to do was admit that none of it felt complete. He rubbed his face slowly, palms pressing against his eyes, trying to erase the headache that never truly went away anymore. The deeper he went into achievement, the heavier it seemed to weigh on him. Every success brought new expectations. Every victory raised the bar higher until even standing still felt like falling. He glanced toward the corner of the room where a leather couch sat untouched, bought for guests who rarely came by this late. His office wasn't a place for conversations anymore. It was a place for transactions. The clock ticked past 12. Tristan didn't notice, because for the first time in a long time, the man admired by thousands felt completely alone in a room built to display everything he had ever wanted. The elevator doors slid open with a muted chime, breaking the stillness of the executive floor. Wilma Hessel stepped out carrying a slim folder against her chest. The office was nearly dark except for the glow spilling from Tristan's corner suite. She had been asked to drop off the finalized documents before morning. Nothing unusual, just another task on a list that never seemed to end. As she walked down the hallway, her heels echoed softly, the sound oddly loud in a building that usually hummed with life. When she reached the glass door to his office, she paused. Tristan sat at his desk, shoulders slumped, head tilted slightly forward as though he were holding himself up by will alone. The man who usually carried the presence of a storm looked smaller somehow, worn thin by something deeper than a long day. Wilma lifted her hand to knock, then hesitated. She had seen executives burn the candle at both ends before, but there was something different about him tonight. His jaw was clenched, eyes closed, fingers pressing into his temples with quiet urgency, as though the world had grown too loud inside his head. She knocked lightly anyway. He didn't respond. Another knock, firmer this time. Tristan startled, looking up too quickly, blinking like someone pulled from a dream he didn't remember entering. He straightened his back instinctively, the polished version of himself snapping into place. "Yes?" he called. Wilma opened the door carefully. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I was asked to leave these on your desk." She crossed the room, setting the folder down in front of him. Up close, the signs of strain were impossible to miss. His tie was loosened, the knot imperfect. Shadows rested beneath his eyes, the kind no amount of money could erase. "You're still working," she said, not as a question. Tristan glanced at the papers, then back at her. For a moment, he seemed unsure what to say, as though he hadn't expected anyone to notice he was still there at all. "Just finishing a few things," he replied automatically. But Wilma had already seen past the words. Wilma lingered at the edge of the office, her hands still resting on the back of the chair opposite his desk. She hadn't planned to stay. This was meant to be a simple delivery, another quiet task before heading home. But something about the way Tristan stared at the papers, as if they might disappear if he looked away, made her hesitate. "There's a break room down the hall," she said after a moment. "I was just there." She turned to leave, then stopped again. "I can bring you some tea," she offered gently. That caught his attention. He lifted his head, studying her as though she'd spoken a language he rarely heard anymore. "Tea?" "Yes," she said with a small smile. "It helps when your thoughts won't slow down." For a second he looked like he might refuse, the habit of independence already rising to his lips. Then his shoulders sank a fraction. "That would be fine," he said, surprised at himself. Wilma nodded and stepped out, moving quickly before he could change his mind. When she returned, the office felt different. He had pushed his chair back from the desk, hands resting flat against the wood as though he had finally allowed himself to pause. She placed the mug beside his keyboard. "Careful," she said. "It's hot." "Thank you," he replied automatically. She started to leave again, but this time he stopped her. "Wait." She turned. He lifted the mug, letting the warmth seep into his palms before taking a sip. The tension in his jaw eased slightly. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Wilma shrugged. "You looked like you needed it." The words were simple, yet they landed with unexpected weight. People around him usually spoke in strategies, projections, outcomes. No one ever talked about what he needed. He nodded once, more to himself than to her. "It's been a long day," he admitted. She met his eyes, and in that quiet exchange something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the direction of both their lives. Tristan cradled the mug between his hands as though it were something fragile, something he might lose if he wasn't careful. The warmth bled slowly into his fingers, easing the tightness he carried without noticing anymore. "You didn't have to stay," he said, finally breaking the silence. Wilma tilted her head slightly. "I didn't mind. Most people never stayed unless they wanted something." An introduction, a favor, a chance to be noticed. Yet she stood there with empty hands, waiting for nothing. "You know," he said, staring into the tea, "everyone around here treats me like I'm made of glass. Either they're afraid of breaking me, or they're hoping I'll break something for them." Wilma smiled faintly. "That sounds exhausting." He laughed quietly, not the kind he used in meetings, but something softer, unguarded. "It is." He set the mug down and leaned back in his chair, studying the ceiling as though it might offer answers. "Sometimes I wonder if I built all this," he gestured toward the glass walls, the city beyond them, just to avoid dealing with who I was before. Wilma crossed her arms loosely, considering him. "Who were you before?" The question hung between them, not invasive, just honest. "No one ever asks that," he said. She met his gaze without flinching. Maybe they should. For the first time that night, he didn't feel like a symbol of success or a name in bold letters. He felt like a tired man sitting across from someone who saw the cracks and didn't step away. "That's kind of you," he said after a moment. "Not kind," she replied. "Just human." The word settled into him more deeply than she could have known. The clock on the far wall slipped closer to 1 in the morning, but neither of them seemed aware of it anymore. Tristan shifted in his chair, suddenly unsure how to continue a conversation that had no agenda. "You don't usually work this late," he said. Wilma smiled. "I don't usually deliver files at midnight either. Tonight just happened to be one of those days." He nodded. "Those days are becoming more common." She leaned lightly against the edge of the desk, careful to keep her distance. "Do you ever stop?" she asked. "Not physically. I mean in here." She tapped her temple gently. His expression changed, thoughtful. "I don't know how." The admission slipped out before he could filter it. Wilma studied him, not with curiosity about his wealth or power, but with the concern one might show a friend. "What happens if you try?" He considered the question. "Everything catches up." Silence filled the room again, but this time it felt comfortable. "I used to think building something big would make me feel secure," he continued. "But the bigger it gets, the harder it is to breathe." Wilma nodded slowly. "Sometimes people confuse motion with direction." He met her eyes, recognizing the truth in her words. "You're different from the others." She laughed quietly. "That doesn't sound like a compliment." "It is," he replied. "You don't talk to me like I'm supposed to be someone else." She shrugged. "I only see what's in front of me." Their eyes held, just long enough to mark the beginning of something neither of them was ready to name. When Wilma finally straightened, smoothing the front of her blouse, the room felt altered, as if a door had opened where there hadn't been one before. "Well," she said softly, "I should let you get back to your work." Tristan watched her walk toward the door, the office suddenly larger than it had felt moments ago. As the door closed behind her, he realized something unsettling. He didn't want the night to return to silence. The first time it happened, again, Tristan told himself it was coincidence. Wilma returned the following week with another set of documents just before closing hours. He noticed her name on the delivery list and felt an unreasonable sense of relief before he even admitted it to himself. She knocked softly, the same careful rhythm as before. "Am I interrupting?" she asked. "Not at all," he replied too quickly. That night the conversation didn't stop at tea. It lingered over small things, the strange habits people develop when they live alone, the way the city looks different depending on who's standing beside you, the forgotten joy of listening without planning a response. Then it happened again, and again. Soon, late-night file drops became something he anticipated. Wilma didn't always bring tea. Sometimes she brought nothing but a willingness to sit in the chair across from him and exist in a room that rarely allowed it. The office, once a place of rigid control, began to soften in subtle ways. He caught himself turning off notifications when she arrived, letting the world wait 15 minutes longer than it ever had before. They never planned their talks. There were no formal invitations. Yet by some quiet understanding, their evenings began to overlap, folding together like two separate routines slowly aligning. One night he noticed the clock read almost 2 in the morning. "You should be home," he said. She smiled. "So should you." It wasn't flirtation. It was recognition, two people acknowledging the same pattern from opposite sides of the glass walls. Neither of them spoke about why these conversations mattered. They didn't have to, because sometimes connection grows best when no one is rushing it. One evening, the rain pressed hard against the windows, the city below washed into blurred color. Wilma had stayed later than usual, her coat folded neatly over the back of the chair. They had already finished talking about nothing when Tristan suddenly leaned forward, elbows on his desk, hands laced together. "Can I tell you something without it turning into a story about profits?" he asked. She gave him a small nod. "You can tell me anything." He exhaled slowly, eyes drifting to the rain. "Today we closed the largest expansion deal the company's ever had. Everyone was congratulating me, shaking my hand, acting like I had just reached the top of some mountain." "And did it feel like that?" Wilma asked. He shook his head. "It felt like standing in a room where everyone is clapping, but no one is really looking at you." She remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I go home to a place that looks like a showroom," he said. "Everything is perfect, and none of it feels lived in. I used to think winning would fill something in me. Now it just adds weight." Wilma leaned back slightly, studying him. "Maybe victories aren't meant to carry the whole meaning of your life," he smiled faintly. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," she replied gently. "It's just not easy." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he met her eyes, something open in his expression that hadn't been there before. "I don't talk like this with anyone," he admitted. She answered without hesitation. "You don't have to impress me." That was the moment he realized he wasn't waiting for the end of his workday anymore. He was waiting for her. Their conversations deepened in ways neither of them announced. One night Tristan glanced at Wilma with an expression she had never seen before, not guarded, not distracted, but uncertain. "Why are you here?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "I brought the budget revisions." "That's not what I mean," he said softly. "People usually want something from me, a connection, a favor, an opportunity. You don't—" Wilma considered his words, then reached into her bag and pulled out her keys, placing them on the desk between them. "That's all I own that matters tonight," she said lightly. "I'm not here for anything beyond the conversation." He frowned slightly. "That doesn't make sense." She leaned forward, resting her arms on the desk. "I don't need your name or your world. I need honesty. If you're tired, say you're tired. If you're afraid, say you're afraid. I don't want the version of you that wins rooms." The room fell quiet. "I want the version of you that tells the truth," she added. Tristan stared at the keys, then back at her. He had built entire companies on performance. Yet here was someone asking him to set it aside. "No one's ever asked me for that," he said. Wilma smiled gently. "Then let me be the first." He took a breath, one that seemed to travel deeper than any he'd taken all day. "I'm afraid of stopping," he admitted. "I'm afraid that if I do, I won't know who I am anymore." She nodded as if she had expected exactly that. "Then don't stop all at once, just start being real in this room." He laughed quietly. "You make honesty sound like a small step." "It is," she said, "but it's the only one that changes anything." From that night on, he spoke to her without rehearsing his words. And that changed everything. They never announced their relationship. It unfolded quietly, slipping into place without ceremony. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden shifts in how they spoke to one another. The change was gentler than that. The way Tristan began leaving his office earlier on certain nights, the way Wilma stopped bringing files and started bringing stories from her day. When he asked her to marry him, it wasn't with a grand display. They were sitting on the floor of her small apartment, sharing takeout from paper boxes because neither of them felt like cooking. "I don't want to build anything without you beside me," he said simply. Wilma stared at him, not at the man on magazine covers, but at the one who had learned to speak without hiding. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. They married 3 months later in a small chapel near the river. No press, no announcements, just a handful of people who knew them as people, not as symbols. Wilma wore a simple dress she found in a neighborhood shop. Tristan wore a suit he had owned long before the company's rise. The rings were modest, chosen because they felt right rather than impressive. As she walked down the aisle, she caught the way his hands trembled slightly, the way his eyes softened when they met hers. He didn't look like a leader that day. He looked like a man in love. Afterward, they shared cake with mismatched plates, laughing when a gust of wind threatened to carry away the decorations someone had strung by hand. Later that evening, when the chapel emptied and the lights dimmed, they stayed behind just long enough to breathe it in. "No one's watching us," Wilma whispered. Tristan smiled. "That's exactly how I wanted it." They didn't rush out of the chapel when the last guest left. The river outside carried the faint sounds of traffic, a reminder that the world was still moving, still demanding. But inside those walls, it was just the two of them, standing in clothes that no one else would ever remember. Wilma reached for Tristan's hands. "Promise me something," she said softly. "Anything. Promise me we won't disappear into the lives we've built." He searched her face, the weight of the words settling into him. "What does that mean?" "It means you won't become only a name people admire," she replied, "and I won't become someone waiting quietly in the background. If we ever feel ourselves fading, we say it out loud." He nodded slowly. "I promise." She squeezed his fingers. "And promise me that when things get hard, you won't measure me by what I can give you." His throat tightened. "I could never do that." Wilma leaned closer, her forehead brushing his. "Then I promise to remind you who you were before everything became about winning." They stood there in the hush of a room that had seen countless vows, yet none quite like theirs. Not louder, not grander, but honest in a way that left no space for performance. Tristan kissed her gently, not as a public gesture, but as an answer. Years later, neither of them would remember the exact words spoken that night, but they would remember the feeling, the belief that love, when it grows quietly, becomes strong enough to carry everything that comes after. At first, the questions arrived dressed as jokes. At dinner parties, someone would tilt their glass and smile at Wilma. "So, when are we going to hear little footsteps in that big house of yours?" Wilma would laugh politely, her fingers tightening around her napkin beneath the table. Tristan usually answered for both of them, brushing it off with a confident tone. "We're enjoying life as it is for now." But the questions didn't stop. They followed them into holiday gatherings, into casual lunches with colleagues, into rooms where strangers felt entitled to curiosity about their private world. Every time, Wilma felt the same invisible weight settle on her shoulders. One afternoon, they visited Tristan's parents. His mother hugged Wilma warmly, then rested her hand lightly on Wilma's arm. "You'll make such a wonderful mother," she said, eyes glowing with expectation. Wilma smiled, but the words struck deeper than they should have. On the drive home, she stared out the window while the city passed in quiet motion. Tristan glanced at her, then back at the road. "They don't mean anything by it," he said. "I know," she replied. But knowing didn't make it lighter. In the following months, the kindness of those questions wore thin. Each one planted a new doubt, as though the absence of a child was an empty chair no one could stop noticing. Wilma began to prepare herself before every social event, rehearsing answers that sounded hopeful without revealing the ache behind them. Tristan continued to smile through it all, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened each time the subject came up. What neither of them said out loud was simple. They weren't just being asked about children. They were being asked to justify their marriage. The first clinic was bright and orderly, the kind of place designed to feel reassuring. A woman in a white coat flipped through charts while Wilma sat on the edge of the examination bed, hands folded neatly in her lap. "Everything looks within expected ranges," the doctor said kindly. "Sometimes these things just take time." Time became their answer. When nothing changed, they tried another clinic across town. This one had soft music in the waiting room and walls lined with smiling family photos meant to inspire hope. The results were the same. "Your tests are normal." Another month passed, then another visit, another set of scans, another careful explanation that ended without solutions. Tristan attended every appointment at first, holding Wilma's hand as though they were walking into a shared battle. But each time they left without clarity, the silence in the car grew longer. "Maybe we're just unlucky," Wilma offered one day, trying to lighten the air. He didn't reply. Soon the clinics blurred together. The smell of disinfectant, the low murmur of other couples in waiting rooms, the way doctors avoided firm promises. Wilma began to recognize the same polite sadness in their eyes, a practiced empathy that felt distant from the life she was living. On their fourth visit in as many months, the doctor leaned forward and spoke gently. Medically, I don't see any obstacles right now. Then why isn't anything happening? Tristan asked. The doctor paused. Sometimes the answers don't arrive on a schedule. That night, Wilma lay awake long after Tristan had fallen asleep. She replayed the words in her mind, wondering how something so carefully monitored could feel so out of reach. They were told nothing was wrong, yet everything felt wrong. Wilma stopped mentioning the missed hopes after a while. She kept a calendar in the kitchen, marking small symbols only she understood. When the expected days passed without change, she erased them quietly, making sure Tristan never noticed. In the bathroom mirror, she studied her reflection, as if it might reveal the flaw no doctor could find. She replayed meals in her head, wondering if she should have eaten differently, worked less, rested more. She searched for something she could fix. Late at night, when Tristan slept beside her, she pressed a hand against her stomach and whispered, apologies no one else could hear. I'm trying, she murmured. I promise I am. She avoided baby sections in stores. She turned away from announcements online. Each reminder felt like a private failure she carried alone. One evening, Tristan came home with flowers, a small gesture that should have brought comfort. Wilma thanked him, arranging them carefully in a vase, hiding the tears that burned behind her eyes. Because she was certain of one thing. If something was missing from their life, it had to be her fault, and the hardest part was not knowing how to make it right. Tristan didn't mean to change. At first, it was only small things. He stayed later at the office. He answered messages during dinner. When Wilma asked how his day had been, his replies grew shorter, trimmed down to facts instead of feelings. It was fine, became his favorite phrase. But Wilma could feel the difference. It was in the way he removed his jacket without meeting her eyes, in the way he sighed when she mentioned another doctor's appointment, in the way he lingered too long over his phone when silence crept between them. One night she suggested they take a weekend away, just the two of them, somewhere quiet. Now isn't a good time, he replied, already halfway toward his laptop. Is it ever a good time? She asked gently. He stopped, his back still turned. You know how much pressure I'm under? She nodded. I do. I just thought we might face it together. He didn't respond. Instead, he retreated further into work, not because he cared less, but because he didn't know how to carry disappointment without letting it show. Meetings became excuses. Deadlines became shields. It was easier to lead a company than to admit that something he wanted so deeply was slipping beyond his reach. Wilma watched him drift away in inches, unable to stop it, unable to name it without sounding like she was asking for blame. And in that growing quiet, both of them began to feel alone, even while lying in the same bed. Their evenings became performances of calm. They ate dinner across from one another, discussing schedules, errands, upcoming meetings, anything that kept them away from the truth sitting between them. Wilma asked about contracts she didn't understand. Tristan commented on meals he barely tasted. Then the lights went off. They lay side by side in the dark, the space between them small but heavy with thoughts neither dared to release. Wilma stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, waiting for a question that never came. She wanted to tell him she was afraid. He wanted to tell her he felt powerless, but fear and powerlessness don't know how to speak to each other. They only wait. Sometimes Tristan rolled onto his side, facing the wall, his shoulders stiff as though he were guarding something fragile. Wilma watched his back, wishing she knew how to reach him without breaking what remained. One night she whispered his name. He answered, but his voice carried a distance that hadn't been there before. Yes? She closed her eyes. Nothing. Silence settled again, stretching longer than it should have. They shared the same room, the same house, the same life. Yet every night felt like two separate worlds pressing against one another, without ever meeting. Love didn't vanish. It just stopped finding words. What once felt natural now required effort. They began missing each other in small, almost invisible ways. Tristan leaving before Wilma woke. Wilma falling asleep before he came home. Notes left on the counter replaced conversations. Their home, once filled with soft laughter, took on the quiet order of a place meant only to be maintained. On weekends, Tristan buried himself in reports. Wilma busied herself with organizing rooms that didn't need it. They moved around one another with politeness, like guests afraid to overstay. At social events, they still played their roles perfectly. He held her hand. She smiled at his side. No one saw the growing distance that words could no longer bridge. The absence of answers had created its own presence. Wilma began to sense it in the pauses between sentences, in the way Tristan avoided eye contact when children were nearby, in the way he lingered over conversations with colleagues who never asked personal questions. One afternoon she caught her reflection in the mirror while getting ready for a dinner they were both pretending to want to attend for a moment she didn't recognize, the woman looking back. Not because of age or change, but because the light in her eyes had dimmed. The hardest part wasn't the waiting. It was realizing that waiting had started to define them. Before this story moves forward, pause here for just a moment. Have you ever carried the weight of something that wasn't your fault, yet still felt responsible for fixing it? Maybe you've stood in a room where expectations were aimed at you without words ever being spoken. Maybe you've watched someone you love grow distant, not because they wanted to leave, but because neither of you knew how to talk about the thing that hurt the most. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Wilma isn't losing Tristan because she stopped loving him. She's losing him because life handed them a question neither of them knew how to answer. So share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt blamed for something you had no control over? And if this story is speaking to you, remember to like and stay connected. There's more ahead that may change the way you see everything that follows. The house had never felt smaller. Wilma stood at the kitchen counter rinsing a mug she didn't remember using, watching the thin stream of water disappear down the drain. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, settling softly across marble surfaces that once made her feel proud, that once whispered of a life carefully built together. She heard Tristan's footsteps before she saw him. Not the rushed stride of a man late for a meeting, but something measured, deliberate, the kind of walk that carries intention rather than habit. He didn't greet her. Instead, he crossed the room in silence and placed a manila folder on the table between them. The sound was gentle. The meaning was not. Wilma turned slowly, drying her hands on a towel that suddenly felt too heavy. "What's that?" she asked, though she already knew. Tristan straightened the folder with unnecessary precision, aligning it with the edge of the table, as if order might soften the blow. He remained standing, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the surface instead of her face. "They're documents," he said, "for us to review. For us," she repeated quietly. He nodded. "I've had my attorney prepare them." The room felt distant, as though she were hearing him from the end of a long hallway. Wilma moved closer and opened the folder. The pages inside were clean, crisp, untouched by emotion. Names, dates, signatures waiting to be given. "Why now?" she whispered. He didn't answer at first. She closed the folder and rested her hands on top of it, pressing down as if that might keep the words from escaping. "We were just talking about repainting the guest room," she said, searching his face. "You said the light wasn't right." "I know," he replied. "Then what is this?" Her voice trembled despite her effort to steady it. Tristan finally lifted his gaze. For a moment his expression faltered, not regret exactly, but exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying something too long. "I can't keep living like this," he said quietly. The silence that followed swallowed every sound in the house. Wilma's fingers curled against the edge of the table as though it were the only solid thing left in the room. "Living like what?" she asked. Tristan drew a slow breath, pacing a few steps away before turning back. "In uncertainty," he said. "In waiting. I need to know where my life is going." Her heart beat louder than his words. "We've been building a life together." He nodded. "We've been trying." The distinction struck harder than an accusation. "I've spent my whole adult life creating something," he continued, voice measured but tight. "Companies, strategies, growth plans, everything has direction, everything moves forward, and I don't?" she asked softly. His jaw tightened. "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" Wilma pressed. He looked away again, struggling to shape the truth into something survivable. "I need a future that I can see. I need more than hope." She shook her head slowly. "Hope is what people hold when they care about each other." He didn't respond. "I have waited," she said, stepping closer. "I have sat in clinics and offices and rooms where no one knew what to tell us. I have told myself that love was enough. I don't know if it is anymore," he admitted. The words hung between them, stripped of cruelty but heavy with finality. "You're tired," Wilma whispered. "We both are. But this isn't how you solve it." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a resolve that frightened her. "I don't have the luxury of waiting for things to maybe work out." The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the background, counting moments that no longer belonged to them. "You're talking about me like I'm a risk," she said. He didn't deny it. "I need a future," Tristan repeated, softer this time, as if hoping repetition might make it kinder. Wilma pressed a hand to her chest, steadying her breath. "You already have one," she said. "You just don't recognize it." Wilma stepped around the table, the folder still lying where he left it, its presence filling the room with words neither of them wanted to read. She stood in front of him now, close enough to feel the warmth he once carried so easily. "Look at me," she said. Tristan hesitated, then raised his eyes. "I am standing here," she continued, voice unsteady but determined. "I am breathing. I am loving you the only way I know how. And you're telling me that this is not enough." "That's not what I mean," he replied quickly. "Then tell me what you mean," she whispered. He searched for language that would not wound, but the truth is rarely gentle when it arrives too late. "I don't want to wake up 10 years from now still asking the same questions," he said. "I don't want my life to feel unfinished." Wilma reached out, resting her hand lightly against his chest. His heartbeat met her palm, steady and real. "I am your life," she said quietly. "Not a pause, not a delay. I am the place you stand while everything else figures itself out." Tears slipped free despite her resolve. She didn't wipe them away. "I didn't marry you for certainty," she went on. "I married you because you let me see who you were when no one else was watching." He inhaled sharply. "You promised me we wouldn't measure each other by what we could provide," she reminded him. His eyes flickered with memory. "And now you're telling me that the part of me that cannot be scheduled is the part you can't live with." She leaned closer, her voice breaking. "I am not a problem to be solved." Tristan looked as though he might say something, anything, but the words stayed locked behind his lips. Wilma lowered her hand from his chest, the space between them widening without either of them moving. "I am your future," she whispered, more to herself than to him. But the man in front of her no longer heard the promise in those words, only the fear. Tristan opened his mouth as if something might finally come, an apology, a confession, a retreat from the edge he had brought them to. Nothing did. The quiet stretched, heavy and complete. Wilma watched his face, waiting for the smallest crack in his resolve. She had seen him negotiate billion-dollar deals with less effort than it took him to hold her gaze now. His eyes shifted toward the window, then to the folder on the table, anywhere but her. "Say something," she pleaded. He closed his eyes, the muscles in his jaw tightening as though he were holding himself together by force. When he spoke again, it was barely above a breath. "I can't do this anymore." The words were not cruel. They were final. Wilma nodded slowly, absorbing the impact in careful pieces. "So this is how it ends," she said. "Not with anger, not even with a fight, just absence." He didn't argue. Her hands trembled as she reached for the chair beside the table, steadying herself. "You once told me I was the only place where you didn't feel like you had to perform." He swallowed hard but said nothing. "I guess I'm the one who forgot that even quiet love can be replaced." Tristan's shoulders sagged slightly, but he still didn't move. The folder remained untouched between them, the most honest voice in the room. Wilma straightened, drawing in a long breath. "You don't need to explain," she said softly. "Your silence already has—" She turned away from him, not because she wanted to leave, but because staying any longer would mean begging for something he had already withdrawn. Behind her, the house remained perfect. Ahead of her, nothing was certain, and somehow, the uncertainty felt more honest than the life she had been trying to preserve. Wilma moved through the bedroom as though she were walking through someone else's life. The wardrobe doors stood open, revealing rows of clothes chosen for events that no longer belonged to her. She ran her fingers along the fabric, trying to decide which pieces were hers and which had been shaped by a world she never truly entered. 2 suitcases lay open on the bed. Just 2. Not because she owned little, but because carrying more felt like admitting she was still attached to a place that had already let her go. She folded slowly, carefully, as though the act itself demanded respect. Each item brought a memory with it: a dress she wore to their first charity gala, a sweater he once borrowed during a cold evening, a scarf he bought her during a rush trip that promised more time later. The room was quiet, except for the sound of zippers and fabric sliding against itself. In the bathroom, her reflection stared back at her with unfamiliar calm. She touched her cheek, half expecting tears to appear on command. They didn't. Down the hall, she could hear Tristan moving about, opening drawers, closing doors, pretending that practical sounds might fill the hollow left behind. Wilma returned to the bedroom and reached for a framed photo on the dresser, the two of them standing on a balcony overlooking the river, unaware of the future waiting for them. She studied it for a long moment, then placed it face down in the drawer, not because she wanted to forget, because she needed to remember without letting it define her. When the suitcases were full, she zipped them closed and sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping beneath her weight. This room had once been a promise. Now it was a departure. Wilma carried the suitcases down the wide staircase herself. She didn't ask for help. Each step echoed softly through the mansion, the sound reminding her how much space she was about to leave behind. Rooms filled with furniture chosen by designers, hallways meant to impress visitors who would never know her name. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused. The front door stood tall and polished, its glass panels reflecting the woman she had become in the last few hours. She hardly recognized the steadiness in her posture, the way her shoulders no longer curved inward. Tristan was waiting near the entryway, his hands shoved into his pockets as though he didn't trust them to remain still. He looked at the suitcases, then at her face, his eyes finally settling on something close to regret. "You don't have to leave tonight," he said. She shook her head. "I do." The house had learned his voice over the years. Commands, laughter, negotiations. Tonight it seemed to shrink from it. Wilma set the suitcases down and slipped on her coat, the motion simple, unceremonious. She didn't glance around to take anything in. She already knew every corner too well. He stepped closer. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," she replied. The honesty in her answer surprised him. She wasn't trying to protect him. She simply didn't have the strength to carry anger anymore. "I just didn't know how to stay," he added. "That's the difference between us," Wilma said gently. "I stayed even when I was afraid." He swallowed, searching her face for something. Forgiveness, reassurance, permission to feel less broken. She offered none of it, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. At the door, she reached for the handle and hesitated for the briefest moment, not to turn back, but to gather herself for the life waiting beyond the threshold. "Take care of yourself," Tristan said quietly. She turned, meeting his gaze one last time. "I will." Then she opened the door. Cool night air slipped into the grand entryway, carrying the scent of rain and distant traffic. Wilma lifted her suitcases and stepped outside, the door closing behind her with a sound so soft it barely registered, yet it marked the end of everything she had been trying to save. She walked down the front path alone, not looking back, carrying only what she could hold and the quiet, strength she had discovered too late to share. The apartment smelled faintly of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs. It was the kind of place people chose when they were starting over. Thin walls, uneven floors, a bathroom barely wide enough to turn around in. Wilma had learned every creak in the hallway, every rattle of the pipes at dawn. The space was modest, but it belonged entirely to her. She stood in front of the bathroom sink holding a small white stick between trembling fingers. The mirror above the sink was spotted with age, its corners clouded, but it reflected her face with painful honesty. There were no marble counters here, no sweeping windows overlooking the city. Just a single bulb buzzing quietly overhead, and a woman trying not to hope. She placed the test gently on the edge of the sink, then folded her arms across her chest as if she could physically contain whatever the result might be. Minutes stretched into something unbearable. She tried not to think about the calendar marks she had stopped making after leaving the mansion. She tried not to remember the clinic rooms, the polite smiles, the empty assurances. When the time had passed, she lifted the test again, her heart thudding so loudly she was sure the neighbor could hear it. 2 lines, clear, undeniable. Wilma stared at them, blinking once, then twice, waiting for them to disappear. They didn't. Her reflection in the mirror seemed to lean closer, as if another version of herself had stepped forward to confirm what she was seeing. She pressed her lips together, afraid that if she breathed too deeply the moment might break. But the lines remained steady and real. And for the first time since she walked out of the mansion, the quiet of her life didn't feel empty. It felt full. The room began to tilt, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make Wilma reach for the sink with a shaky hand. Her fingers slipped against the porcelain, and before she could steady herself, her legs folded beneath her. She sank to the cool tile floor, the test still clutched in her palm. It wasn't fear that brought her down. It was the sudden release of everything she had been holding inside since the day she closed the front door of the mansion behind her. Tears streamed down her face, silent at first, then rising in small broken sounds she tried and failed to contain. She pressed her forehead against her knees, her shoulders shaking with the kind of crying that comes when something too big to understand finally arrives. "How?" she whispered. She hadn't been trying. She hadn't been hoping. She had told herself that chapter of her life was over, that she had learned to let go of expectations. Yet here she was, in a bathroom that barely held her, carrying something she had been told might never come. Her laughter slipped out unexpectedly, thin and trembling. It mixed with her tears, neither fully one thing nor the other. She lifted her head and looked at the test again, making sure it hadn't changed while she wasn't watching. Still there, still real. Wilma leaned back against the wall, the coolness grounding her as the weight of the moment settled into her bones. She had left everything behind: wealth, comfort, the man she once believed would be with her forever. And now, in the smallest space she had ever called home, life was beginning again. When the tears finally slowed, Wilma rested both hands against her stomach, not because there was anything to feel yet, but because she needed to believe it was true. "I'm not alone," she whispered. The words felt strange in her mouth, as though they belonged to someone braver than she had ever been. She said them again, louder this time, letting them fill the narrow bathroom. "I'm not alone." The apartment, which had often echoed with emptiness, suddenly felt occupied in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't that anything had changed physically. The sink still leaked, the floor still chilled her skin. Yet something essential had shifted. She had spent months convincing herself that independence meant carrying everything by herself, that strength meant silence, that dignity meant never needing anyone. Now she understood how wrong that was. She wasn't facing the world on her own anymore. Wilma pulled herself to her feet, moving slowly, carefully, as if the floor itself had become precious. In the mirror, her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked, but her expression had softened. She thought of all the nights she had pressed a hand to her heart, apologizing to no one for a future that never arrived. That future was here now, not in grand rooms or perfect plans, but in a quiet bathroom above a bakery, carried by a woman who had learned how to stand after falling. She rested her forehead against the mirror, breathing in shallow, steady rhythms. "You're with me," she said, smiling through the last of her tears. Wilma sat on the edge of her narrow bed, long after the bathroom light had been turned off, the pregnancy test resting on the nightstand like a secret too powerful to share. Her first instinct had been to reach for her phone. Tristan's name still lived at the top of her contact list, untouched since the night she left. She stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen, imagining his voice on the other end. Surprise, confusion, relief, questions she wasn't ready to answer. But then she pictured the folder on the kitchen table, the careful way he had said he needed a future. She set the phone down, not because she wanted to hurt him, because she needed to protect herself. This child wasn't proof that she had been worth keeping. It wasn't a late solution to a problem he had already chosen to walk away from. It was something new, something that belonged to her first. She lay back on the bed, eyes tracing the faint cracks in the ceiling. "If I tell you," she whispered into the empty room, "I'll lose this moment to your expectations." And she wasn't willing to do that. So she made a decision, not dramatic, not loud, but firm. She would carry this life forward without reopening the door she had just closed. Whatever came next would come because she chose it, not because she was asked, not because she was needed, but because she was enough. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains, settling gently across Wilma's face. She woke with her hands still resting on her stomach, as though she had been holding herself together all night. She made tea in the small kitchen, the kettle hissing softly, and for the first time in months she didn't feel the need to rush. There were no boardrooms waiting, no expectations pressing in from every direction, just the quiet rhythm of a new day and the steady knowledge that something precious was growing within her. She took a sip and closed her eyes. "I don't have to be anything for anyone," she said aloud. "I already am." It felt strange to speak so kindly to herself. For so long, her sense of value had been tangled in another person's disappointment. Now, standing barefoot on worn linoleum, she began to see how narrow that definition had been. She wrote a list that afternoon, not of tasks, but of things she wanted to remember. She wanted to laugh more easily. She wanted to forgive herself for things no one had the right to measure. She wanted to build a life that felt honest, even if it was small. The list wasn't about perfection, it was about permission. As she folded laundry later that evening, she caught herself humming, a sound she hadn't made in a long time. It surprised her so much that she laughed out loud. Wilma didn't know what the future would look like, but for the first time since she had been told she wasn't enough, she no longer needed someone else to confirm her value. She had already found it, reflected back at her in the quiet miracle she carried. The bakery closed at 8, and by 9 the street below Wilma's apartment went quiet except for the hum of passing cars and the occasional clatter of dishes from the cafe on the corner. Those were her favorite hours. She would lie on her narrow bed with one hand resting on her stomach, the other holding a worn paperback she barely read. What mattered wasn't the book, it was the conversation. "Today I burned the toast again," she said softly into the stillness. "You'd think I'd have learned by now, but I'm getting there." She smiled to herself, picturing a tiny listener somewhere inside her, a presence she couldn't yet feel but already knew. "I don't have everything figured out," she continued, "but I promise you something. You'll always know you're wanted." Some nights she told stories about the people she used to be afraid of, turning old memories into gentle warnings. Other nights she talked about nothing at all, the way the morning light hit the windows, the smell of bread downstairs, the comfort of warm socks after a long day. These conversations weren't prayers or plans. They were promises made in whispers, shaping a bond before the world could add its weight. The next weeks taught Wilma how little she truly needed. She helped the baker downstairs before dawn, tying her hair back while trays of bread filled the shop with warmth. In the afternoons she cleaned offices where no one noticed her, leaving behind order where others had left their rush. The work was honest, the pay was modest, and yet she felt more present than she ever had in rooms filled with luxury. Some evenings she came home with aching shoulders and a handful of loose coins in her pocket. She counted them at the kitchen table, not with fear, but with quiet determination. "See," she said to the gentle curve of her stomach, "we're doing just fine." She learned how to stretch meals, how to listen for discounts, how to find comfort in small routines, folding towels just so, leaving her shoes neatly by the door, saving a bit each week even when it felt impossible. Nothing about her days looked impressive, but every step carried her forward, and that was enough. Some nights the weight of everything caught up with her. She would sit on the edge of her bed after a long shift, shoes still on, staring at nothing in particular while the room darkened around her. The exhaustion wasn't just in her body. It lived behind her eyes, in the spaces where questions waited. "Are we going to be okay?" she whispered. The words trembled, but they didn't stay unanswered for long. Not by sound, but by feeling, the steady presence she carried, the quiet reason she had learned how to stand again. Tears came easily now. They fell when she remembered the life she once had. They fell when she counted the bills. They fell when she passed store windows filled with things she no longer needed. But they didn't empty her. They cleared her. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand and took a breath, letting the heaviness rise and fade without turning it into shame. "It's all right to be scared," she told the tiny listener inside her. "Bravery isn't loud. It's just choosing to keep going." The room didn't change, but she did. Success used to be something Wilma could point to. A polished home, a full calendar, invitations that made her feel included in a world that prized appearances. Now it looked nothing like that. It looked like making it through a day without breaking. It looked like learning the bus schedule and finding the cheapest place to buy fruit. It looked like walking up 3 flights of stairs without stopping, even when her legs ached. One afternoon, she caught her reflection in a store window, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, shoes worn thin at the soles, and she smiled. "I don't need trophies," she murmured. "I need honesty." She thought of Tristan's office, the awards, the endless praise that never filled the quiet inside him. Then she thought of her small kitchen, where the kettle whistled every morning like a reminder that she was still here. This is what winning feels like, she told the life she carried. Not applause, peace. For the first time, she understood that achievement wasn't about standing higher than everyone else. It was about standing steady, even when no one was watching. As the weeks passed, Wilma noticed something she hadn't expected. She wasn't just preparing for a child. She was repairing herself. The anger that once tightened her chest had softened into clarity. The shame she used to carry had begun to lift, replaced by something steadier than confidence, acceptance. Each night, she traced slow circles over her stomach, feeling for movements that hadn't arrived yet, speaking as though the tiny listener could already understand. "You're teaching me how to forgive," she said quietly. "Not for what happened, but for what it made me believe about myself." She no longer rehearsed conversations with Tristan in her head. She no longer imagined walking back into rooms that had closed their doors. Her focus had shifted. It was no longer about proving anything. And in that gentle preparation, Wilma felt the pieces of her life finding their place again, not as they had been, but as they needed to be. Snow arrived without warning, thick and determined, covering the narrow street outside Wilma's apartment in a soft white hush. She noticed it only after the pain began. At first, it was nothing more than a tightening low in her abdomen, unfamiliar, insistent, but still easy to dismiss. She stood at the window with a mug of tea cooling in her hands, watching flakes gather on the ledge, telling herself she would sit down in a moment. Then it came again, stronger. She set the mug down, heart skipping a beat. Her breath shortened as another wave followed, leaving her gripping the back of a chair. "Okay," she whispered, the word breaking apart. Okay. She had prepared for this moment, read articles, packed a bag, rehearsed the route in her mind. But nothing could fully prepare her for how suddenly her body claimed control. She pulled on her coat with clumsy hands, each movement deliberate as though the air itself had grown thick. Outside, the snow muffled the sounds of traffic, turning the city into something gentler than she had ever known it. Wilma stepped into the storm, one hand braced against her stomach, the other holding her bag close. The cold bit through her gloves, but she welcomed it. It kept her awake, focused. "I'm coming," she murmured, not sure whether she was speaking to herself or the child who was ready to meet the world. The streetlights blurred as she flagged down a passing cab, the driver helping her into the back seat without questions. As the car pulled away, she glanced once more at the quiet building behind her. She had entered it alone. She would not leave the hospital the same way. The hospital doors slid open and swallowed the snow behind her. Warm air rushed over Wilma's face as attendants guided her from the cab to a wheelchair. The world became a sequence of clipped instructions and practiced hands. Name? Wilma Hessel, she managed. First child? A nurse draped a blanket over her shoulders, the fabric barely containing the tremor that ran through her body. Another tightened the strap, the blood pressure cuff, murmuring reassurance while numbers flickered across a small screen. They moved quickly, steering her past rows of seats, where strangers stared with expressions that mixed sympathy and curiosity. The hallway stretched ahead, bright and narrow, its walls echoing with hurried footsteps. "Breathe with me," a nurse said, matching Wilma's pace. "Slow in through your nose, slow out through your mouth." Wilma tried. The pain rose anyway, folding her forward in a sharp gasp. "You're doing great," the nurse encouraged. "We're almost there." They pushed her faster now, the wheels humming against polished floors. Doors opened and closed around them, revealing brief glimpses of rooms she might soon inhabit. As they turned a corner, Wilma caught sight of families clustered together, some holding flowers, others pacing with restless hands. She had imagined arriving with someone beside her, a familiar voice anchoring her to the moment. Instead, she arrived carried by strangers, and still, she did not feel abandoned. because she was bringing with her the one person she had never truly been without. They were nearly at the end of the corridor when Wilma felt the world tilt again, not from pain this time, but from recognition. Her eyes lifted without thought. Tristan stood just ahead, near the entrance to another ward, his posture tense, his face turned slightly away as he listened to someone speaking beside him. For a heartbeat, Wilma believed she was mistaken. She had not seen him in months. Her life had shrunk into work shifts, grocery lists, and late-night conversations with someone she hadn't yet met. Tristan belonged to another version of herself, one she had already set down. But there he was. His gaze shifted, scanning the corridor without intention, until it found her. The change was immediate. His eyes widened, his mouth parting in a silent question that no one else could hear. The noise of the hallway faded, leaving only the quiet collision of two lives that had not been meant to meet again. "Wilma," he said, the word barely forming. The nurse slowed, following his line of sight. Wilma didn't answer at first. She watched him as though he were a memory brought too close, the past standing in the shape of a man who no longer knew her. Another wave of pain drew a sharp breath from her, grounding her in the present. "Yes," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Tristan took a step forward, then stopped, as if unsure whether he had permission to exist in her moment. "Why are you—" he began, then fell silent, because the answer was already written across her body, and he was only just beginning to read it. Only then did Wilma notice the woman beside him. She was small, her shoulders curved inward, as though the room required effort to hold her upright. Tristan's hand wrapped around hers with a protectiveness Wilma had once known by heart. The woman leaned into him slightly, her face pale beneath the hospital lights. The sight did not bring anger. It brought understanding. Wilma had imagined many versions of this moment, running into him on a street, seeing his name in headlines, hearing about him through mutual friends. None of them prepared her for the quiet reality of him standing there, already belonging to someone else in a way that felt heavy rather than new. Tristan glanced down at the woman, then back at Wilma, caught between two worlds that could not meet without breaking something. "Are you all right?" the woman asked softly, noticing Wilma's strained expression. Wilma nodded once. "I will be—" The nurse cleared her throat, uncomfortable with the tension she could not name. "We really should keep moving." Tristan tightened his grip on the other woman's hand, as if anchoring himself before letting go of the life he had once shared with Wilma. "I didn't know," he said quietly, the words directed at Wilma but carrying everything else beneath them. She didn't reply. "Because some truths are too large to hold in a hallway." The nurse guided Wilma forward again, but Tristan took another step closer, unable to let the moment pass unanswered. "Wilma," he said, his voice stripped of the confidence she remembered. You're expecting?" She met his eyes, the ache in her body steady and insistent, the truth no longer something she could protect or postpone. "Yes," she replied simply. "I'm in labor." His breath caught. For a second he didn't look like a man who ran companies. He looked like someone who had just been handed a reality he wasn't prepared to hold. "With my child," she added, not as an accusation but as a fact that deserved space. The corridor seemed to contract around them. The woman beside him shifted slightly, surprise crossing her face before she masked it with careful calm. Tristan's gaze dropped to Wilma's stomach, his expression softening into something that hovered between wonder and regret. I never knew. You never asked," Wilma replied quietly. The words were not sharp. They didn't need to be. A nurse glanced between them, clearly sensing the gravity of what had just been revealed. "We need to get her settled," she said gently. Tristan nodded automatically, still struggling to process what he had been told. "You're going to have a son," Wilma said, the certainty in her voice surprising even herself. His lips parted, then closed again. Whatever future he had planned was dissolving, replaced by a truth he could neither reject nor undo, and the woman holding his hand was only beginning to understand the weight of it too. The woman beside Tristan shifted closer to him, her grip tightening as though the floor itself had become uncertain. "I should sit," she said quietly. Her voice was light, but her face betrayed exhaustion that went far beyond the night. A nurse who had been hovering nearby immediately moved toward her. "Let me get you a chair," the nurse said. Tristan guided her to a nearby seat, his attention torn between Wilma and the woman who leaned against him with closed eyes. "She's not well," he explained softly, turning back toward Wilma. "We came because she had another episode this morning." Wilma studied the woman more closely now, the faint tremor in her hands, the way she breathed as though even that small task required effort. "I'm sorry," Wilma said, and meant it. The woman opened her eyes and looked up at Wilma, her gaze steady despite her frailty. "I didn't know about you," she replied. "About any of this?" "Neither did I," Wilma thought. "She can't carry children," Tristan added, the words landing like stones between them. "We were told it wouldn't be safe." The woman gave a small nod, confirming what he hadn't fully said. Wilma closed her eyes briefly, not in bitterness, but in the recognition of how differently life had chosen to move each of them. The future Tristan had chased had arrived, just not in the way he imagined. And now all three of them stood suspended in a moment no one had prepared for. No one spoke after that. Not because there was nothing to say, but because every word felt too small for the moment that had settled over them. The corridor hummed softly with distant activity, rolling carts, muted announcements, doors opening and closing somewhere far away. Yet around Wilma, Tristan, and the woman leaning into his side, the world seemed to pause. Wilma rested both hands on the arm of the wheelchair, breathing through another wave that rose and passed. The nurse waited patiently, sensing that pushing forward too quickly would fracture something invisible but essential. Tristan stood motionless, his shoulders squared as though he were holding himself upright by will alone. He looked at Wilma, then at the woman beside him, caught between past and present with no space to move. The woman finally broke the quiet, not with questions, but with compassion. "You must be tired," she said to Wilma. Wilma nodded. "I am." Their eyes met, not as rivals, not as strangers, but as two people bound by circumstances neither had chosen. Tristan opened his mouth, then closed it again. His voice, so often quick to command, had no place here, and in that stillness something settled between them. Not forgiveness, not closure, but recognition. A shared understanding that some moments cannot be repaired, they can only be carried. Before the story continues, pause with Wilma in that hallway. She has just come face to face with the man who left her while bringing his child into the world, and discovered that he is standing beside a woman who cannot have children and is fighting for her health. If you were Wilma, what would you do? Would you open the door to the past for the sake of the child? Would you protect your peace and walk forward alone? Or would you choose something no one expects? Share your thoughts in the comments. There is no simple answer here, and your perspective might help someone else facing a moment they never imagined. And if this story is moving you, remember to stay connected by liking this video and following the channel. Wilma's choice is coming, and it will change everything. The room was quiet in a way Wilma had never known. Not empty, not lonely, just still. The nurse adjusted the blankets with careful hands, then stepped back, leaving Wilma alone with the smallest weight she had ever carried. Her son rested against her chest, warm and impossibly light, his breaths coming in gentle bursts that rose and fell beneath her palm. She stared at him, afraid to blink. Every fear she had ever held, about money, about the future, about whether she was strong enough, faded beneath the simple reality of his presence. He was not a solution. He was not a reward. He was a beginning. "Hello," she whispered, her voice catching. "I've been waiting for you." His fingers curled reflexively around the edge of the blanket, and she laughed softly, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. Tears slipped free again, but these were different from the ones she had shed alone in her apartment. These came from relief, from awe, from the recognition that love had arrived without needing to be earned. She traced the curve of his cheek, marveling at how something so small could hold so much meaning. "I don't know how to do this perfectly," she told him, "but I know how to stay." Outside the room, voices moved past, lives continuing on their own paths. Inside, Wilma remained still, the world narrowing to the steady rise of her child's chest. For the first time since the day she was told she wasn't enough, she felt whole, not because someone else had returned, but because something new had chosen her. The nurse returned with a clipboard, asking routine questions that Wilma barely registered. Weight, time, small details that felt oddly unimportant compared to the life resting against her skin. "What name would you like to put on the chart?" the nurse asked. Wilma hesitated. She had carried many ideas in her heart over the months, names she whispered into the quiet of her apartment, trying to feel which one belonged to the tiny soul who had kept her going. She looked down at him now, his face relaxed, his mouth forming shapes that would one day become words. "Eli," she said at last. The name settled easily, as though it had been waiting. "Eli," she repeated, testing it softly. "You came when I thought I was finished believing." The nurse smiled. "It suits him." Wilma nodded, pressing a kiss to her son's forehead. "I chose it because it means strength," she said, more to herself than anyone else, not the loud kind, the kind that stays. She thought of all the nights she had spoken to him without knowing his face, of the promises she had made in whispers. Giving him a name felt like the final step in bringing him fully into her world. Eli stirred slightly, his fingers flexing as if responding to the sound. "I'll protect you," she murmured. "Even when I'm tired, even when I'm afraid." The nurse left them alone again, and Wilma remained still, letting the name echo through her, a reminder that this moment belonged entirely to her. The door opened quietly. Wilma didn't look up at first. She was tracing small circles on Eli's back, focused on the warmth that anchored her to the moment. But she felt the shift in the air, the presence of someone who carried history with him. When she raised her eyes, Tristan stood just inside the room. He looked smaller than she remembered, as though the walls had stripped him of every role he once wore. His gaze went immediately to the bundle in her arms, his breath catching when he took in the shape of the child he had never expected to meet. "May I?" he asked, not finishing the sentence. Wilma didn't answer. She only nodded once. He stepped closer, his movements careful, almost afraid that too much noise might break the fragile peace of the room. When he finally stood beside her, he leaned in slightly, studying Eli's face as though he were seeing the world for the first time. Tears slipped free without warning. He covered his mouth with one hand, the sound that escaped him not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, something in between, born from relief and loss colliding at once. "I thought I knew what I was chasing," he whispered. "I didn't know it would look like this." His shoulders shook, the polished control he once prized dissolving in the presence of a child who had arrived without permission. Wilma watched him, not with bitterness, but with the distant understanding of someone who had already done her grieving. "This is your son," she said softly. The words landed fully then. Tristan dropped to the chair, beside the bed, pressing his palms against his eyes as if he could contain the moment. "I'm sorry," he murmured, the apology carrying more weight than any explanation he could offer. Tristan lowered his hands slowly, his eyes red, his composure fractured in ways Wilma had never seen. "I thought I was being practical," he said, staring at the floor between them. "I told myself I was choosing a future, not running from you." He looked up at her, his voice unsteady. "But standing here now, I see how blind I was." Wilma remained quiet, allowing the truth to rise without interruption. "I was afraid," he continued, "afraid that waiting meant failing, afraid that if I didn't control the direction of my life, it would slip away." He glanced at Eli again, his face softening. "I didn't realize that love doesn't wait on schedules. It arrives when it's ready." His hands clenched together. "I left when you needed me most. I made your pain something you had to carry alone." Wilma drew a breath, steadying herself. "I was so busy chasing certainty," Tristan said, "that I lost the only thing that ever made me feel real." Silence settled again, but it was different from the silence that had ended their marriage. This one carried truth instead of avoidance. "I can't undo what I did," he whispered, "but I need you to know that I see it now." Wilma met his gaze, not as the woman he had left, but as the mother who had found her strength without him. "I believe you," she said. Wilma adjusted the blanket around Eli, a quiet reminder that this moment belonged to more than just the past being reopened. "I don't need you to rewrite what happened," she said evenly. "I needed you then. I don't need you now in the same way." Tristan swallowed, the meaning settling into him. "You're not here because I'm angry," she continued. "You're here because a child has entered the world, and that changes everything." She looked down at her son, then back at Tristan. I spent months learning how to carry disappointment without letting it define me. I don't want to return to a life where I'm measured by expectations." Her voice never rose. It didn't have to. "I won't go back," she said gently. "Not to the mansion, not to the role I was trying to survive." He nodded slowly, accepting what he had already known was coming. "But I'm not taking him away from you either," she added. "This isn't about punishment. It's about truth." She held Eli a little closer. He deserves honesty, and he deserves parents who are present in the ways that matter. Tristan's eyes glistened again. "I don't know how to do this." "You'll learn," Wilma replied. "Just like I did, alone at first, and then with him." The room felt lighter, as though the tension that had followed them through years of silence had finally loosened its grip. Tristan leaned forward slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled in the room. "May I see him closer?" he asked. Wilma shifted slightly, angling Eli so his face was visible. Tristan studied every feature as though trying to commit the moment to memory. "He has your eyes," he said quietly. Wilma smiled faintly. "I think he has his own." Tristan reached out, stopping just short of touching, waiting for permission. Wilma nodded. His finger brushed the edge of the blanket, then Eli's tiny hand, which closed instinctively around it. The effect was immediate. Tristan's breath hitched. He stared at the point of contact, his expression caught between awe and resolve. "I won't disappear again," he said. "Not from him." Wilma watched him carefully, not as someone looking for reassurance, but as a mother deciding what kind of future she would allow near her child. "I don't need you to be perfect," she replied. "I need you to be present." He nodded. "I can do that. I will protect him," Tristan continued. "Not with money or titles, but with time, with listening, with showing up even when it's hard." Wilma held his gaze, weighing the sincerity in his words. "Then start now," she said softly. He straightened, the promise settling into him with quiet gravity. In that small hospital room, amid whispered words and fragile beginnings, a new kind of commitment was formed, not one bound by luxury or expectations, but by the simple act of staying. The morning after Eli's birth arrived quietly. Light filtered through the thin curtains of Wilma's hospital room, settling across the pale walls and the small sleeping bundle in her arms. She had not slept much, yet she felt more rested than she had in years. A soft knock sounded at the door. Tristan stepped inside carrying a paper cup of coffee and a small bag from the hospital cafe. He looked uncertain, like a guest unsure of his place. "I thought you might be hungry," he said. Wilma thanked him, setting the cup aside untouched. She watched him carefully, noticing the familiar way he scanned the room as if already considering how to improve it. "There's a car waiting outside," he said after a pause. "Whenever you're ready, I can take you home, home." The word hovered between them, heavy with meaning. "I've spoken to my assistant," he continued, misreading her silence. "The mansion is prepared. The nursery can be finished by tonight if you want." Wilma rested her cheek against Eli's head, breathing in the faint scent of soap. "I won't be going back there," she said calmly. Tristan blinked. "You don't have to decide now. I already have." She looked up at him, not with anger, but with certainty. "That place is filled with the life I outgrew." He set the bag down slowly. "It would make things easier. For you," she replied gently. He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing how often he had mistaken convenience for care. "I don't want Eli to grow up in rooms where people measure themselves by what they own," Wilma added. "I want him to know the sound of laughter more than the echo of empty halls." Tristan studied her face, recognizing a resolve he could not bargain with. "I can support you," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but support doesn't mean control." And in that moment, he understood that the life she was choosing could not be bought back. Wilma dressed Eli in the softest outfit she owned, one she had washed twice in her apartment sink before coming to the hospital, unsure whether she would ever have the chance to use it. The fabric was plain, unremarkable to anyone else, yet it felt perfect against his skin. She moved slowly, savoring each motion. This was not a routine handed to her by nurses or instructions. It was her beginning. Tristan stood near the window, speaking quietly on his phone. She could hear fragments, logistics, schedules, arrangements, the language of the world he knew how to navigate. She turned toward him when he finished. "I'm going back to my apartment," she said. "The one above the bakery." He frowned slightly. "It's small." "So is he," she replied, smiling down at Eli. "And somehow he has already filled it." Wilma described the life she imagined. Early mornings with the smell of bread drifting through open windows, walks in the neighborhood where people greeted each other by name, evenings spent reading aloud even when Eli couldn't understand the words. "It's not about having less," she said. "It's about having what fits." Tristan listened without interrupting, perhaps realizing that this vision required a different kind of wealth, one he had never learned to collect. "I'll help however you need," he offered. She nodded. "That means respecting the life I'm choosing, not replacing it." He accepted the boundary, not as rejection, but as instruction. Wilma tucked a tiny hat onto Eli's head and laughed when it slipped sideways. "We'll figure things out as we go," she murmured to her son. Tristan watched them, the simplicity of the scene reshaping his understanding of what he had once called success. For the first time, he saw a future that didn't need to impress anyone to matter. Wilma carried Eli through the hospital doors herself. The winter air met them gently, no longer harsh with falling snow but calm, as if the city had softened in welcome. She paused at the top of the steps, adjusting the blanket around her son, taking in the world he was about to enter. Tristan stood beside her, keys in hand, uncertain. "Are you sure you don't want me to drive you?" he asked. She looked at the quiet street, the waiting taxi at the curb, the life that was no longer waiting to be rescued. "I'll be fine," she replied. He nodded, stepping back. Wilma moved forward slowly, her steps steady, the weight in her arms both new and entirely natural. As she passed through the sliding doors, she felt the shift, not dramatic, not loud, but permanent. She had not walked out of the mansion with answers. She walked out of the hospital with herself. Eli stirred against her chest, his breath a soft rhythm that grounded her more firmly than any promise ever had. "I'm here," she whispered to him, "and I'm staying." The taxi door opened, and she climbed in, settling carefully into the seat. The driver glanced back with a kind smile before pulling into traffic. Behind them, the hospital faded into the distance. Ahead, a small apartment above a bakery waited, filled not with expectations but with possibility. And Wilma, once defined by what she could not give, now carried the strongest proof of who she had always been, not a woman left behind, but a mother walking forward, unafraid. Wilma's story isn't about wealth or status. It isn't even about heartbreak. It's about the quiet choices we make when no one is watching, the moments that define who we are long after success has faded from the headlines. She was not left because she lacked love. She was left because love was no longer convenient, and yet life returned to her in the smallest room she had ever lived in, reminding her that worth is not measured by what you provide, but by what you protect. Too often we live in a world that treats people like investments. If someone produces results, they are celebrated. If someone struggles, they are slowly erased. We don't always say it out loud, but we live by it, in relationships, in families, in friendships, in the way we choose who deserves our time. Wilma was asked to prove her value. Instead, she learned to recognize it. She didn't become stronger because her circumstances improved. She became stronger because she stopped asking permission to matter. Loyalty is not glamorous. It doesn't come with awards or applause. It doesn't fit neatly into speeches about growth or winning. But loyalty is what carries people through seasons that don't offer anything in return. And that is why it matters. Tristan didn't lose Wilma because he was cruel. He lost her because he was afraid that love without guarantees wasn't enough. Afraid that waiting meant failing. Afraid that the things he couldn't control were somehow the things he couldn't live with. And that fear cost him the one person who saw him before the world decided who he should be. We all stand at that crossroad at some point. Do we choose what looks impressive, or do we choose what stays when everything else becomes uncertain? This story doesn't ask you to judge Tristan. It asks you to recognize him. In the moments you walk away from difficult conversations, in the times you prioritize certainty over connection, in the decisions you make to protect an image instead of a person. Wilma walked out of a life many people would envy, not because it was unbearable, but because it no longer reflected who she had become. And she didn't walk out bitter, she walked out free. That is the real ending of this story, not the birth of a child, but the birth of a woman who finally understood that her worth was never up for negotiation. So before you move on with your day, pause here. Ask yourself one question. Who in your life has loved you before you became someone the world applauded? And what have you done to protect that bond? If this story touched you, if it reminded you of a choice you're still trying to make, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Your words may be the encouragement someone else needs tonight. Tap the like button if you believe people should be valued for who they are, not what they can offer. And if you want more stories that speak to the real moments that shape us, remember to subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime and share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Because stories like Wilma's aren't just meant to be watched, they're meant to be lived.